Welcome to Tech Tuesday 43. Today we're going to talk about deception, IP, and surprise. First, we're going to take a moment of silence due to the ongoing hostage situation. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's in the future, so it didn't happen yet. So in the year 2030, wooden cars are a very hard idea. Problem is that you have to attach the pieces of wood together. So how do you do it? So Big Car Corp, which can stand in for your favorite big car company, is developing a way of bonding together pieces of wood. And magically, the European Union requires, after Big Car Corp got 80% of the way there, the European Union requires that 50% of the cars be wooden. So there's a big business opportunity. Now, a small company, Woodhype, is also developing a wood bonding method. And they filed a patent on bonding pieces of wood using micro screws, and they even asked for expedited examination in order to get the patent faster. And of course, they also filed patents on other bonding methods. And Woodhype, Hype, show wooden car parts in shows, and Big Car Corp is interested in perhaps in investing in Woodhype, and they come for a visit, and everybody signs NDAs. And then in the year 2031, a year later, it turns out that Big Car Corp believes in what's called efficient infringement. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but basically it means I calculate my risk, I calculate my payoff, and if it looks okay, I infringe intentionally. And they build factories for making wooden cars and for bonding them together using micro screws. So far, I guess this is the usual type of stories that we're used to hearing about a company that was or wasn't careful with its trade secrets, and the competitive advantage was stolen. But it turns out that Woodhype understands IP and understands deception. And if you're familiar with, stonefish, that it hides and puts out a lure for fish to catch. So Woodhype has a secret that they did keep, which is that micro screws loosen after 2 years outdoors. So it's not a very good thing to make a car out of. And another thing that Woodhype know, and they kept a secret, is that the best way to bond is actually using shrimp tails. Shrimp tails are like dovetails. I made it up. And, when you have pieces connecting together and you have several layers and so on. And it's one of their patents. It's in patent application number 3. Remember, I said they filed patents on alternative ways. And it also requires more expensive machinery. In 2032, after they discovered what happens 2 years outdoors, Big Car Corp discovers that they tooled all of their factories for a bad bonding method. And in 2033, their competitor, Carmaker Inc., buys Woodhype for what's called an undisclosed sum, very nice sum. So one IP manager gets fired and the other one can retire. So what happened here? So obviously there were patents involved and there were secrets involved, but what's really important is that Woodhype planned a deception operation against people who might want to steal their technology. In this case, Big Car Corp. And the deception wasn't only that Big Car Corp stole something useless, but in fact, Big Car Corp are going to miss the deadline of 2035 because they were led in the wrong direction. That's deception. Now, I've been having talks with people over the past 2 weeks about deception. And patents are inherently deceptive. And why is that? Because patents don't give you a complete solution. And many patents don't work at all or don't work well. So usually when you're filing a patent, unintentionally, and we'll get to that later, there's a level of deception. But if you do it intentionally, you can be much more effective. And I'm not talking about cheating. I'm not talking about illegalities, but yes, there's still ethical issues, and I'm not going to talk about them. But I am going to bring a famous philosopher, Kant, and he says that if he wants people to leave him alone so he can write his book, he packs his luggage, and people assume that he's going away, except he doesn't. So Kant didn't consider that to be immoral. Lysander, who's pictured on the right, is a Spartan admiral or vice admiral, was a legal issue, who won the war against Athens. And the way he won is by using deception. He fooled the Athenians into leaving their ships unguarded and unmanned in the middle of a war. Interesting story. And guess what? He destroyed their ships, and that was the end of it. And in the picture, they're knocking down the walls of Athens. And what he used to say, when the lion's skin is too short, you must patch it with that of a fox, meaning if you're not strong enough, you should be smart instead. One more important stream of deception besides military and nature, of course, is magic. There's a lot of deception going on in magic. And a lot of the clients we work with are, let's call them technological magicians or people that make demos. So they come at least partly pre-trained to understand the importance or possibilities of deception. Now, what I want to make clear is that just keeping something a secret is not necessarily deception, and that in general, deception has different failure modes than secrecy. Deception doesn't necessarily require secrecy, and it can fail in completely different ways with different consequences. So I'm giving you two definitions for deception. One is by a guy named Moore, and I have a link later, and one is by a guy called Henderson, who has a great website, Deception by Design, and I took some interesting stuff from there. The point is, deception is deliberately misleading somebody into taking actions or erroneous sense making, either by communicating or by hiding the truth or manipulated stuff or distorted stuff or just plain falsified information. There's a famous, and we're going to get to it, but this guy pictured on the right is called Dudley Clark. And Dudley Clark was one of the masters of deception during World War II. He worked for the British. And one of the points that he makes very strongly is that your goal, and he discovered that's a hard way, by a too successful deception operation in Ethiopia. He wanted to make the Italian army move, and they did. They moved exactly where he didn't want them to go. And he said, your focus in deception should not be on what people think, but in what you want people to do. In any case, I'm sure you're familiar with the saying from Winston Churchill, who said that in wartime, truth is so precious, you have to surround it by a bodyguard of lies. And that's why people say in time of war, truth is the first casualty. But Dudley Clark believed the opposite. He thought the lie was so precious that you have to surround it by an escort of truth. And since we're in deception, we're going to follow Dudley Clark. So we had some insights regarding deception, and I just copied out a few of them, which seem to me to be especially related to things having to do with IP. And if you look at the right, you see a leaf insect, and it's wonderfully camouflaged on top, and a different picture where it's painted red and there's no camouflage at all. And we'll understand why in a minute. So the first issue is deception planner needs access to the leadership. Okay, the IP people can't do deception on their own. Well, sometimes. But then the question is, who is in charge of deception at the company? Okay, remember Dudley Clark, he was in charge of deception. He had a whole group, a force. And maybe the IP guy can be in charge of deception. Maybe not. Maybe the company will screw it up for him. Second, the more you know about your target, the better you can do a deception. And this means that if you're trying to fool a competitor, you should know what the competitor knows, believes, does, is capable of, and so on. The next two have to do with what exactly are you doing in a deception. The first one is you should support the enemy's false notion. So if you know what your competitor believes, you should often encourage them to continue believing that. And one of the ways he suggested doing that is by using the enemy intelligence, help build up your story. So imagine you have a company that makes wood bonding methods, and you go to shows, and somehow you find out what Big Car Corp is thinking about you. They're thinking that you have a weak IP position and that using micro screws sounds like the only way to solve their problems. In that case, you want to help them build up that story more. You say, yes, and we filed a patent on micro screws, and look, it published, and look how much we got. Okay, and then that helps them develop the story that you have a bad IP position and they know what they should copy. Deception needs support. That's why it's an operations function. And one of the things you do in deception is you build a false order of battle for IP people. It means that you're perhaps building a false IP portfolio section or protection. He also believed that every real operation should have a complementary deception, and I'll explain why. If the competitor has to choose between what you're doing and what you're not doing, and he doesn't know which one it is, it means he might have to double the effort. And there's also a good chance he'll make a mistake and go in the wrong direction. Needless to say, I'm not sure that most people follow this suggestion. So why do we need deception? We have the best IP in the world and the best patent portfolio and the best people voted, and everybody knows it's scary IP. But the answer is that forewarned is forearmed. Your competitors know everything about your public IP, so they have time to invalidate it, or to prepare to invalidate it, to design around, to license in other technology, and so on. On the other hand, what could be better, like in the story of Wood Hype, that just as your competitor is building momentum and put an investment in the wrong direction, that's when you pull out the rug from under them. Okay, it's much more effective than them saying, oops. Now, none of your strategies are perfect, and therefore you always, I believe, need some amount of deception, unless, of course, you're the 800-pound gorilla, one of those huge tech companies, and then you don't need deception. You just do whatever you want. I made here a list of links where you might find interesting material about deception. So Clark says, and I don't completely agree, that you should only do deception when you have a clear objective. So let's ask ourselves, what is our objective as IP people in having a deception? So here's a few objectives. One is freedom of action. We want to be alone. The second one, if you're familiar in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a SEP field, somebody else's problem, which makes people ignore you. If you're a startup company, being ignored by your competitors or by potential competitors is very valuable. You can use deception either to avoid notice or to avoid attacks. You can also use deception in order to cause collaboration. And there's a great example in Asimov's story, Blind Alley, where Burkhardt uses small amount of deception in order to change the galaxy. I recommend reading it. Sometimes we do deception in order to surprise our competitor. Sometimes we do it in order to subvert the competitor, maybe make them unprepared for an attack that we're planning on doing, maybe want them to be confused so they don't know what exactly they should be doing. So sometimes we want the target of the deception not to do something at all, like not to go into our field, or we want them to go in more slowly, or we want them to go in and fail, like wood hype, or we want them to go in and after they went in, they should realize that they have to collaborate with us. They have to license technology. They have to buy our company. Okay, this is not all of the possible goals of a deception, but it's an interesting range of goals. Before I give a particular detail on one of them, there are a lot of different ways to classify deception. And the first one I'm suggesting has to do with the relationship between the deception and the IP. So the first one is using the deception for the IP. If we make a particular subject uninteresting, there will be less research in that field, there will be fewer prior art publications, and then we can get better IP. So imagine we're going on a long-term R&D program. It's going to take 5, 6, 7 years. It's in our interest that nobody else does it because then they can't prevent us from getting IP unintentionally. You can use IP in order to cause a deception, and the story of Wood Hype filed an expedited patent, made it look very important. Okay, so they used IP in order to help the deception. And you can also use deception against IP. Okay, you have a competitor and people sitting in the IP management of the competitor have to decide how much to argue with the patent office and how much money to spend. And if you hype a workaround and say, oh, that patent's not important, we have a great workaround, or there's this prior art that really teaches everything, then your competitor might narrow their patent or spend less money on it. Just examples. One classic classification of deception is into A-type and M-type. And the question is, are you increasing or decreasing the certainty level of the target? In one of them, the target is sure what he needs to do. And he's absolutely wrong about it. So he just makes them more sure going in that direction. In the other one, you make the competitor unsure what to do, and people who are unsure might not take decisions or might spread their energy and move more slowly. Is a deception by omission, you're hiding stuff, or by commission, you're saying stuff? As we'll see in a few minutes, it's usually both of them. A very important distinction is whether the deception is a long-term deception or a short-term deception. In other words, are we doing a deception only until we have enough money to play with the big boys? Or are we planning a deception which has to last for 5, 10 years? Is a deception fixed? In other words, we set it up and it goes on by itself, or is it adaptive that we always have to change what the deception is about? In any case, whichever one of them you use, you're going to need multiple channels of communication. And a last classification, and I guarantee there's many more. Is it a blatant deception? We put out a decoy for people to follow, or is it a hidden deception? We make sure we get ignored. And again, it's usually both. One type of deception end goal is surprise. You want to surprise somebody. And I mentioned before that sitting around and waiting is a very risky strategy. It gives your opponent the initiative, and there's always some problem for them to find. So two types of surprise. There's surprise defense. Let's say the competitor believes that they have a patent and we're infringing. And we let them believe that, except that patent is completely invalid. And at the right moment, we pull out our piece of prior art and say, look, your patent's completely invalid. All of the effort and planning you put into attacking us is gone. And if you're lucky, that gives you enough time for the company to move into the next state. Another type of surprise is surprise attack. We want to attack somebody. Usually attacking is not just using IP, but using other tools as well. And this type of surprise is especially useful when the company, when your competitor is in a rigid process or after they built up momentum, because then when you suddenly surprise them, they have very difficult decisions to make. And if you do the surprise at exactly the right time, when they have enough momentum to be in pain, but not so much momentum that they can't stop, it will cause your opponent to stop. So surprise is great, but we don't want it to happen to us. We don't want it to happen to us. I'm going to talk later about counter deception. We need business intelligence, and we also need IP intelligence, and we also need some sort of loop in the company where the results of the BI and IPI are analyzed and then used to help understand what's actually happening. Usually when we think about IP is moving very slowly. But you can imagine having a cascade of IP and other events so that, let's say, every 3 months, another surprise comes out before the opponent is managing to get a hold of what's actually happening. Last but not least, if you're using IP for surprise, are you trying to get tactical surprise or strategic surprise? More about that in this link. Not about IP, but yes, about tactical and strategic surprise. Okay, so what are we planning on deceiving about? And who are we planning to deceive? So let's talk about what do we want to deceive about? The world. We want people to think something is difficult. We want people not to be aware of an alternative solution. We want potential competitors not to know what the correct market needs are. We want them to think that there is no viable market, okay, and so on and so on. Maybe we want to deceive about us. They shouldn't know our activities, our plans, the quality of our IP. Maybe they should think it's better than it is. Maybe we want them to discount it. Our solutions and what is needed for them to work. It's very common to file a patent and keep a few trade secrets in reserve. And in order to build a complete solution, you need the patent and the trade secrets. So we might want to deceive about whether there are trade secrets or how important they are. Maybe we want to deceive the competitor about the competitor. Okay? We want to convince the competitor that the IP isn't good. We want to convince the competitors that they can't get very far, that there's a critical skills they need to build. They need to have some sort of infrastructure. Okay, that could be very valuable. And of course, we don't have to deceive everybody, just a certain number of people. And I said it before, but I'll emphasize it. Do not deceive the patent office. Do not deceive the court. Do not deceive your investors. That's clearly illegal. But what you do need to do is ask yourself, how do we not deceive our investors while we're deceiving the competitor at the same time? And we know that your investors are often talking to other people. So I was thinking about it. If we talk about the wood hype example, you could tell your investors, we know how to bond wood. You can show them a report that shows that you managed to bond the wood together properly. And you can tell them that you filed patents on the bonding method, which is in the report. What you don't need to tell your investors is which one of your patents is about the bonding method they're actually using. And you also don't need to tell your investors that you're trying to deceive the competition. Unless, of course, during the due diligence, these questions will come up. So that's a possibility. Of course, you need legal advice whenever you try to deceive somebody. So if you remember, the second slide is this presentation is not legal advice. Question people naturally ask is, patents are public. How can you deceive people if everything is public? And I ask in return, is there no deception in chess? Chess is a classical game of strategy with full information. Everybody can see everything. There's a Polish grandmaster who passed away, Tarakower, and he had the following statement, which I think is self-explanatory. Any opening is good enough if its reputation is bad enough. By the way, he has a lot of cute sayings. But the point is, if you do something and people think you're stupid, you definitely deceive them. But in patents, we're lucky because most patents don't clearly communicate in a way that anybody that reads a patent can understand, which gives you the opportunity to either portray your IP position as a strong position or as an innocuous position. There's the issue of ownership. Patent says who owns it. Doesn't have to be you. Patent has a disclosure and it also has claims. You can have 40 pages of disclosure and the claims can be on 39 of them, or the claims can be on 1 page out of that 40 pages. And maybe you change the claims from being on the 39 pages to the 1 page. There can be lots of cooperating trade secrets hiding. Old patents, emphasize, most patents stay hidden for 18 months. So the point is that deception is not only about hiding, but it's also about strategic exposure of information. So we take into account what our competitor wants to see and what other forces are affecting what they're thinking. And we make sure to expose the kind of information which will help them believe and act in our favor. The talk is about IP. Trade secrets are another type of IP, and they're naturally secretive, which definitely helps deception. There's a Japanese saying, the talented hawk hides its claws. So maybe you're hiding your clause in a trade secret. The very fact that you have a deception is a trade secret. Same time, the existence of the trade secret could also be a secret and can be used as part of a deception. Know-how is less flexible than trade secret, but it could serve a similar function. I was wondering if you can deceive with trademarks. So obviously you can dazzle, you file lots of trademarks and nobody knows which one's important. The problem, the way I see it, is that real trademarks are usually tied to a brand, and you don't want to play around with your brand. Imagine if Nike came out now and turned out to swoosh, it was just part of a deception. Okay? That would be very painful. On the other hand, intent to use filings, meaning that you ask for a trademark, but you're not actually using it, can be used to set up a picture that shows your competition. For example, yes, you're actually planning on going into a different market. You're already getting trademarks and filing patents and publications in the newspaper and whispering things to investors. So you could use trademarks as part of deception. Some types of IP, like designs and expedited patents, publish quickly, and that could be valuable if you want to make sure that the information comes out. Because remember, deception happens in the mind of the target. If you can't communicate with them, they don't get deceived. IP also has other uses. I don't know, licensing. So if you're trying to portray a patent as being unimportant, people won't want to license it from you. And other business activities, of course, need to be aligned with deception. So when you deceive, you don't only use IP, your IP should give the same story as your non-IP. Startups. Why am I focusing on startups besides the fact that I like representing them? It's because each stage of the startup might have a completely different type of deception goal and a different challenge. If you start out in stealth mode, so you're keeping everything secret, but not only you're keeping things secret, you don't want to be noticed. At some point, you want to start having exposure, or you will anyways. Employees leave, your patents publish, people start talking. Now, your goal is not that you shouldn't be noticed, but that the problem should not be noticed. It's a small company, it's solving a problem nobody cares about, it's a really difficult problem, and the solutions they're trying to do is stupid. Don't copy them. Don't compete with them. Unfortunately, it's complicated because your investors have to be told something else. They have to be told the problem is interesting and we can solve it, and we have half of the solution already. One of the problems is that because people are talking so much, they talk too much. When you're looking for investments, you need simultaneously to encourage investment and also to convince your competitors, but in a way, partly your investors, that copying you is not possible or not worthwhile. When you start market penetration, your main goal is not to look like a risk to the people whose market you're going to be stealing away. But at the same time, it's a big challenge. You have to make a lot of noise and appeal to customers, or you're never going to make it. And once you are in and you have a foothold, then it's the other way around. Now you have to be invincible, inevitable. Okay, so each one of these can be served by deception, but obviously a different deception. What's good about startup companies is we have a built-in deception. Usually what you did last year and said was the most important thing in the world is actually, and you know it now, of course, but not before, total garbage. Okay, so you already have the beginning of a deception campaign out there, and there's no reason to kill old patents, especially if it helps your competitors believe that the old way of doing it is the right way of doing it. Last but not least, some types of startups work in a winner gets all situation. There can be only one, which means you're going to have competitors and you have to knock them out. So you should be preparing surprises, and surprises go hand in hand with deception. Deception is risky. There's what's called organizational risk. It's complicated to do. There's opportunity cost. The energy you spend on deception, you're not going to spend on something else. It can cause people not to believe you. It definitely looks bad in court. If you're successful, you might have to stay with the deception. And sometimes you can't reveal what you did. And there can be overreactions. If you cheated, you're going to be sued. If you get people in the company used to the idea that lying is good, well, they're going to lie back to you. As much as we have employees who don't believe in IP, we definitely have employees who don't believe in deception. Here's a few examples of deceptions in IP. Either I actually saw them or I should have seen them. So I mentioned before, we have an application. Let's say there's two uses. One of them is in the shoulder and the other one is in the knee. Okay? So we write a patent and we talk about the shoulder. Shoulder, 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 shoulder. The device we actually describe, in at least half the pictures, is the one optimized for the knee. We just don't explain that it's optimized for the knee. And somewhere in the application, we say, oh, you can use a device in the shoulder, in the knee, and in the belly button, and so on. When somebody reads that patent, they will be led to believe that you don't have a good position on the knee, when in fact, you have a great position on the knee, and all of these features you put in are actually special for knee. A lot of use of hype in order to encourage misunderstanding by non-IP people and missing. Using IP as a way of engaging with somebody, maybe as a decoy for real negotiation. Pretending to infringe when you're not infringing. You put out a decoy because you are infringing, but in 2 years you won't be. So you put out a decoy that people think they know what you're doing, and by the time they actually want to sue you, you're not doing it anymore. Allows somebody to overstate the value of IP that they want a license from you. And vice versa. People like copying concepts like strategy from military, and of course, deception comes from military as well. But IP and business in general are usually not like war. In war, you often want to destroy your enemy completely. And a startup definitely, well, not definitely, has a lot of trouble doing that. And Clausewitz was against deception. He did not believe in it. He said it takes too much energy. Sun Tzu, he did believe in deception. And again, the reason might be because he didn't want to destroy the enemy army. So it's believed. And that's why you want to do what's called systemic interference, and deception is a good way of doing that. The duration of deception is different. Usually in military, not always, unfortunately, the duration is a few months. In IP, it could be several years. And it also means that you can't just misdirect somebody for a minute. It has to be continuous. For example, if you prepare a document, every time you look at the document, they should be distracted from looking at what's important. IP, we're talking about R&D, things are changing all the time. The IP becomes obsolete by itself. Many deceptions simply become irrelevant after a while. On the other hand, you have an opportunity to make reality, or at least to make reality in the minds of people who don't know. And I said before, I don't agree that you shouldn't deceive without a reason. And the reason why I'm saying that is because in the military, you have an enemy. In business, you have competitors. Some of them don't exist. Deception could be useful to prevent them from coming into existence. Gordon Whaley was a big researcher on military deception, and he has here a theory which deception is built out of hiding the real and showing the false. And why am I mentioning that? Because I'm giving you not exactly a flow chart for planning a deception, but perhaps a methodology. Obviously, you start with your goal, you have a timeline, you magically generate options. You are going to show things anyways, because that's what companies do. So what are you going to show extra? You are going to be hiding things anyway. So what else should you be hiding? You have to figure out your particular failure modes. And you have to ask yourself, how are you going to wind down the deception when you're done? Before last, IP is really good for deception. Why? Because IP is a publication, but it's a publication with weight and authority. So you get some sort of spotlight effect. It also has a psychological effect. People are scared of it. There's a promise involved. IP definitely has a secrecy aspect. IP has a commitment aspect. When you do something with IP, it looks like you mean it. You're committed to it, even though you're not. IP is complex, which means you can do a lot of add-on interpretations. And there's a lot of normative behaviors that have IP together with them. So if you're doing a deception and you do a fake normative behavior and you do fake IP to go with it, looks good. Finally, counter deception. So if we're doing deception, other people want to do counter deception. It turns out it is really difficult to do a perfect deception because, as Jones, who wrote a secret document in 1942, says, that no imitation can be perfect without being the real thing. Think about tanks that are made out of wood covered with panels or inflatable rubber tanks. But it is surprising what can be done by dexterous suggestion. So the job of the deceivers is to do the dexterous suggestion, and the job of the counter deception is to find that out. Henderson has two concepts, tree focus and pink moth. I have a link on the next slide. In order to make it more difficult for other people to detect what's imperfect, or if they detect it, to make it appear less significant. Now, if you detect deception, maybe you can use IP to take advantage of it. Maybe you can trap your target. I asked before who's in charge of deception. Who's in charge of the counter deception? Same person? Not the same person? I don't know. I have here a few slides that I'm not going to talk about, just so you have it. List of anomalies suggesting deception, the pre-focus method of what you do in order to reduce the chance of somebody detecting. And here's a link. This is pre-focus. Here's a link to pink moth. Book Intent to Deceive, and they have 8 different ways to deceive somebody. Dewar also wrote a book on deception, and he has principles and techniques. So here's principles, but I am going to mention this one about timing. Give enough time to the victim to consume false indicators. Okay? But not enough time to analyze them. I don't know about the second, but definitely the first. And he has a list of techniques. Obviously, some of them are not relevant for IP. So what's your take home? If you don't use deception, it makes your IP a sitting duck. Some IP is inherently deceptive. We can learn from the military and from magic. Deception is a tool of the weak. And here's a nice graph from one of those references, I believe more, that shows blue is a balance of power, let's say against the Soviet Union, and red is deception. And you can see how the stronger you are, the less deception you have, and vice versa. So deception is definitely a tool of the weak, like strategy. And one of the questions you should ask yourself, are we going to do a big deception or little deception? And the second question you should be asking, am I being deceived right now? Not by this talk, of course, but when I look at a patent, at a competitor, am I being deceived? So as an example, you can generate deception plans. Okay, and I'm asking to make a short deception plan and a long deception plan for a small player and for a big player. And I'm suggesting to use a Whaley format, which is not perfect, but it's very straightforward. What am I hiding? What am I showing? Okay, I'm stopping the recording now.